So, we left off last time talking about Madison's view of citizenship. So let's get a little bit further into that, but bring it up to the current day because, well, Madison, that's over 200 years ago. So Madison's view of citizenship, recall, is this idea that people are self-interested, and so too much democracy, right, non-Republican democracy, he thinks is a problem. He thinks that instead we need not just citizens to act virtuously, because that won't happen all the time, but instead we need to elect leaders who are inherently virtuous. Whether or not that applies to our current leaders, I think is a little bit questionable, but that was at least Madison's idea, that our leaders should have virtue to be able to look beyond themselves. Well, what do we think of in terms of citizenship today? Do we still prefer to have leaders, and can we trust our leaders to have Madison's idea of Republican virtue? Or what should our citizenship look like now? Are there some parts of the country that prefer more direct democracy, right? Individuals voting versus others? Or should there be? So in the US, we have a Republican form of democracy, but with some forms of direct democracy like referenda and initiatives. But we could model our citizenship on somewhere like Switzerland, where the vast majority of policy is decided by the public. Everyone votes directly. This is if you ever went to vote and in addition to voting for people, there was, say, an amendment to the state constitution or a referenda. There was ever an amendment to the state constitution or a referendum where there was some sort of big block of text that you read and then voted yes or no on, as opposed to voting for a person. That's direct democracy. So what would we prefer in this country? Another way that we should think about citizenship now, and one that's part of more current controversies, is defining the who are we when we say we. Are we a melting pot or are we a gumbo? Well, the question then is really, if we're a melting pot, we expect new immigrants to assimilate to whatever American culture is. And we have to have some idea of what it means to be an American. But we could instead think of ourselves, instead of like a melting pot, as more like a gumbo, right? Where there's a base, a roux, that brings us all together, but there's still distinctive pieces, right? Where we can distinguish the okra from the shrimp from the rice. But underlying all of it, there's some glue, that roux, that holds us together. As we have more immigrant and new populations, which do you think we are now? Are we a melting pot where everyone eventually gets Americanized? Or are we a gumbo where everyone stays distinct? And which is better? So where do we come from? You're an American citizen by our standards by a few different criteria. You can either be born in the United States, jus soli, right, which is the right of the soil. This is actually pretty rare globally. In most countries, being born in that country doesn't actually make you a citizen there. Instead, your citizenship is conferred based on your heritage, which isn't the other way you can become or be a U.S. citizen. You can be born to American parents. And this is the idea of right by blood, which is far more common in much of the world. The idea that your citizenship is based on lineage as opposed to location. What this means then is that people who are citizens of other countries and have children in the U.S. have children who, at least in theory, could have dual citizenship depending on where they're from. So those persons, they could be immigrants or they could be here temporarily, right, on a travel visa. But let's talk about them in the context of immigrants. Immigrants are people who move away from the country of their original citizenship to some other country to live or work. This can be permanent or it can be temporary. And if it's permanent, then often immigrants try and go through what's called naturalization. Naturalization is really just the process of changing your citizenship from the one you're born with to the citizenship of the state that you're now living in. So if I leave the United States and move to Australia and decide, wow, I really like it here, staying forever, then I might try and go through the naturalization process to become an Australian citizen so that I can exercise things like a right to vote there, as opposed to an immigrant who doesn't go through the naturalization process. You then don't have the same rights and privileges of citizenship. Now, not every immigrant chooses to naturalize. So take a minute and read Pew's report. I won't get into all the details of who naturalizes and who chooses not to, who prefers to maintain their citizenship elsewhere, even as they live and work in the United States. Now, to become a citizen of the United States, to go through naturalization, you have to pass an English test and a civics test. You don't necessarily have to speak English, but you generally have to pass the English test. There are exceptions, and we could talk a long time about English-only laws and when those exceptions are important. The most important part, though, is the civics test. So when I've taught this class in the past, I've given this civics test. It's not super long. And it's amazing how many people can't get that part right. So what about you? Could you get the civics test right? Google online and take a look at the study guide. Think about how many of those questions could you answer right now. If it's not very many, that's okay. That's why you're in this class. But hopefully by the end, you'd be able to ace that naturalization test. Now, in the context of immigrants, we are really thinking about those who are making a decision autonomously to come to our country without necessarily any intention, maybe intending to go back, but not being forced to come here for some reason. We want to differentiate that kind of immigrant with people who are either seeking asylum or who are refugees. People who are seeking asylum are people who, for one reason or another, need to leave their current country for generally safety reasons or to escape political or religious persecution. So if you can't stay in your home country for religious reasons, like, for example, the Pilgrims, you've all heard the Pilgrim story every year for Thanksgiving probably, right? They left Europe, mostly the United Kingdom, at the time Britain, to come to the United States to live in the colonies due to religious persecution. Well, if that were to happen today, fleeing one country for another to escape religious persecution would be asylum. Now, to get asylum, you apply for asylum before you leave your prior country. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have any intention of naturalizing. Refugees, on the other hand, are people who are fleeing their country because of persecution, just like asylum seekers. But unlike asylum seekers, they're asking to be allowed to stay after the fact. So there's been a lot of talk in the news about the refugees from Syria. They didn't take the time to fill out an application saying, can I please come to wherever, when their city became a war zone, which many of the cities in Syria are now. They just left and went to wherever they could get to and then asked for permission to stay. That's a refugee. In the international community, there are pretty strict laws on what it means to be a refugee, what it means to asylee, and what are the grounds for granting either refugee status or asylee status. Those, however, are not really immigrants, right? Another set of people that we don't really consider immigrants but might habitate in our country would be students or those with temporary research permits, visas that only allow them to stay in the country for a very set period of time for a specific purpose. So if you wanted to go to Cuba right now, if you left and went to Cuba, you could go on a research visa where you went to study Cuban culture. That wouldn't make you an immigrant to Cuba, but it wouldn't make you a tourist either, right? Because you're there for a purpose. You're a non-permanent worker, researcher, or student, depending on exactly what you're doing. Now, in addition to those terms, we should at least mention the idea of undocumented immigrants and how that term is used and what it really means, because we hear it thrown around a lot. We talk about undocumented immigrants. What we mean are people who enter a country with the intent of staying for some duration, so they're not just passing through, but they are not authorized to be there. So they don't have a passport, the government doesn't know they're there. And that's really the simple definition of an undocumented immigrant. If you go into Canada without your passport, then you are an undocumented immigrant in Canada. Anyone who comes to the United States without having notified the State Department, generally via border control, that they will be there and achieved the proper documentation, they're undocumented. It's really that simple. And it doesn't apply to one particular group. So Latinos, Chicanos, it's not that they're all undocumented, and it's not that all undocumented fall into that category, despite the fact that often in the news, when we hear undocumented, it's used as code word for those particular groups. So over the next week, when you're watching TV or scrolling through Facebook, or probably not listening to the radio because I'm the only one who does that anymore, think about when someone says undocumented, do they mean it in the generic sense, or are they using it as a code word for a particular group of people based on race or ethnicity? Now, we have an immigration policy for a lot of reasons because there are conflicting views on what we want in terms of immigrants. Who do we want to be a part of our we? And this goes back in part to whether or not we see ourselves as a melting pot or a gumbo, but also what do we want to throw into this either gumbo or melting pot? Historically, we've always limited immigration, but who we limit it to or what the criteria are have often changed. And in recent years, the controversy of our immigration policy is focused predominantly on Latinos and Chicanos. But historically, there have been lots of iterations. In the period around World War I and II, German immigrants were considered suspect, and around World War II, Asian immigrants, not just those from Japan, were considered suspect and unwelcome. For a long time, we did not allow the Chinese at all to immigrate. We allowed them to come as temporary workers to build our railroads, but not immigrate. Our immigration policies are often based on some sort of economic need, and historically have not always been ethical. So take a look at the article from, or the video from University of Texas at Austin, and their discussion of Chinese immigrants. How does that now apply to our current immigration controversies of who we should and shouldn't let in? Now, immigration used to be independent, but since 9/11 and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, it's become a part of that organization. When we get to discussions of the bureaucracy and the presidency, we'll talk about the cabinet and the role of departments and why we create departments and what they do. But for now, just want you to think about, what does it mean to say that we're going to have a Department of Homeland Security be in charge of defining who should be able to become a citizen? That's really what it means when we say that immigration is controlled by Department of Homeland Security. It's defining who the we will be in terms of security. So, don't want to dwell on this too much more, but I do think that we should consider why state crackdowns happen on illegal immigration. What is the impetus for saying we want to exclude that group of people from our definition of we? Who doesn't get to be an American, and why are some people resistant to new groups, new classes of Americans? Is it racially, ethnically motivated? Is it religious motivated? Is it economically motivated? Is it some combination thereof? Why was Arizona so hesitant to allow new immigrants? Why did Alabama have issues with immigrants? What immigrant groups are excluded in places like New York? Or how does Minnesota handle immigration largely from places like Somalia? State crackdowns on illegal immigration are often rooted in politics, in that struggle to decide who gets what, when, and how.